Hello, my name is Chris Lehman. I am a musician based out of the greater Boston area, and thank you for stopping by my channel. Today, we are going to be taking a look at a piece I wrote inspired by James Newton Howard's cue Rue's Farewell, which is obviously originates when Rue passes in the first film, but is used, I believe, throughout all four films at different points. I know it's definitely used in Catching Fire when they're going on the tour in the beginning of the film. It's sort of a call to arms, heartbreak, but at the same time, call to action type of piece. So I took a look at and studied the orchestration and the composition of the original piece, and then tried to write something that was very, very similar, not just sort of inspired by, but using a lot of the same harmonic and structural ideas to really try and learn from that piece, learn why it's so emotional, learn what makes it such a beautiful piece, and then write something very similar so that we can really incorporate those skills into our own writing. So let's take a listen to the piece, and then we'll hop right on over into Ableton to break it down. Okay, so here we are in the project. Let's take a quick look at the piano sketch. I wrote this piece in A minor, which is the same as Rue's Farewell. And if you want to break it down by section, we've got something which is pretty similar. I know, or pretty simple, I should say. In the beginning of writing orchestral music for me, figuring out the structure was incredibly difficult because it's a little bit less rigid than writing a traditional song, where we've got very clear divides between verse, pre-chorus, chorus, verse, break, chorus. There's more transition, and it's much more loosely defined. But in this piece, it is pretty darn simple if I just highlight it and separate it. So I've got an intro here of 2 bars. Then we've got our main theme, which is going to be in 8 bars. Then we've got a transition, sort of you could think of it as a B theme, but I think it would be more appropriate to just think of it as a transition into the repetition of our A theme where it grows and gets bigger. Then we've got the repetition of our A theme with the melody and the voicings of the chords changed a little bit. We're growing vertically to get bigger towards the end of the piece there, where it feels its most epic and heroic and heartbreaking and all of those emotions. And then we've got an outro, which is just sort of switching back and forth between our 1 and 4 chords and ending on this weird minor chord with an added major 6 on top, which is just a case of building tension. But you can think of this section here and this section here, both of our, and I guess you could say our intro too. These are sort of, think of them as filler. Not that, but they're incredibly important. If you just repeat a theme over and over and over again, it's going to get a little boring to the listener. It's going to feel too repetitive, where the emotional impact of it, no matter how good your orchestration and your composition is not going to hit home to the listener the way you probably want it to. So having these transitional pieces where there's not really a clear chord progression, you don't have clear cadences to make it feel really resolved, using them to build tension, to build suspense is awesome. It's a way to both extend the length of your piece and make your main themes feel that much more impactful. So let's get into our A theme here, because that is really it's this 8-bar section that really quickly grew into the rest of the piece. So in the context of A minor, if we look at what's going on harmonically, I'll mute the melody as I like to do. What's going on in the context of A minor is that we're starting on our 1 chord. We are going to a minor 5 with the 3rd in the bass. We're going to a minor 4, which is going to be D minor, up again to our minor 5 with the root in the bass, and then we're going into a major 7, acting as our half cadence. The A minor repeats itself, but this time we change the harmonic rhythm. We you can think of it as harmonically going double time, whereas in the beginning here, it took a full bar to change chords. Now, as we're building energy, building momentum, building tension, you can see that there's a new chord every half bar up until our final chord. But for these 3 bars, there's a new chord. This is, it is a new chord. So yeah, there's a new chord every half bar. So we're going from our 1 minor, again, to our 5 minor, but this time, again, just faster. Then we get the James Newton, not that it's original to James Newton, but what James Newton uses in this piece to get the really cool Hollywood sound, where we're using chords from outside of our home key. In this case, what he's taking advantage of is using the major 4. So in A minor, right, we've got all white keys. So our 4 from A is this D. Now, if we're using all white keys, the D chord is going to naturally be minor. We've got D, F, and A. But what he's using is a D major chord, which has an F sharp. And so, depending on the context in which you use it, this can either be an incredibly heroic, happy sound. In this case, it sort of is. But what he's doing is using this. Look at what's going on in the bass here. There's pure stepwise movement from our minor 3rd of our 5 chord to the major 3rd of our 4 chord to a minor 3rd of our 4 chord. So this is going to work really well, really beautifully, in the sense that it's going to sound really natural because we're just walking down from. And it's also going to give us a very sad sound, a very commonly used Hollywood sound of major 4 to minor 4. We've got this brief moment of uplifting, happy, heroic whatever, down into immediately into a minor sound, getting us back into our home key. And so this repeats itself a lot throughout the piece. I shouldn't say a lot, but a couple of times throughout the piece. And I think for me, when I was trying to learn how to use chords from outside of the home key to try and get that cool orchestral Hollywood sound or whatever, finding ways to use them not a ton, but just in a very strategic way. If you've got a moment in your piece where you're walking up the scale or walking down, and there's a note in between that you thinking that's a great time to think, all right, how could I use this note? So if we're in C minor, which is the key that I know best, just because when I first started learning about my scales, C major was the first one I learned. Obviously, being all white keys, it's easy to learn, so I just learned C minor along with it. So for a long time in my writing, right, I was thinking of how can I C, B flat, A flat, G was this awesome emotional walking down the scale. But I wanted to take advantage of this A here being between the B flat and the A flat. And thinking about how to do that and make it work was sort of scary and intimidating because I didn't necessarily know what to use. I tried to use an A minor, which sort of sounds a little funky. I think switching back and forth between using the major third from my home key right after, it sounded a little funky, but we need to remember that if we want to use a note in our chord progression, it doesn't have to be the root of the chord we're using. Thirds are very commonly in orchestral music and sort of music in general, but thirds are very commonly used as a bass note. They're awesome for being followed up by something that feels really resolved. If you've got a chord with a third in the bass that goes to a chord with the root in the bass, it's going to feel more resolved. They're awesome for building tension. And they're really awesome for introducing these chords which are out of our home key. So what we're doing in this case is this exact thing where we're going in the context of A minor. We've got G, which is the 7 in A minor, and then we're going down to the F sharp, down to the F. And we're instead of going from, I guess what I want to say is instead of going from minor 5 like this down to our major 4, which sounds a little bit more out of place. It doesn't flow nearly as well. To have this stepwise movement in the bass helps it really, really flow and almost feel like it's just a heartbreaking part of the key that we're in. So yeah, that I wanted to take a moment to talk about this because I think it's the thing that if I were a beginner composer trying to learn some of the basics of, I shouldn't say basics because it's pretty advanced, using chords outside of your home key, this is a great way of doing it, and it's something that you can hopefully incorporate into your own writing. Is taking advantage of, if you're in minor, try to find ways to make the major 4 fit into your piece. It's going to sound freaking awesome. And don't be afraid to use this major third in the bass. It sounds really cool. So we've got minor 1 into minor 5 into major 4 into minor 4. Then we go up into our minor 5 again, and then we get this brief major 5 where this G sharp appears in the bass, and then we go quickly down into a minor 4 here with the F in the bass with the minor third, which is sort of a weird cadence. It wouldn't traditionally be used as a, it's not an authentic cadence. We're not going back to the 1. It's not really a half cadence in the context of minor. Generally, we think of our half cadences as ending on a 5 or a 7. But because this 4 chord has been the main focus of the emotion that's going on in this piece, ending it on the 4 chord just felt really natural to me. So if I take the melody, which is, let me just highlight just the melody for a second. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to have it play all C's here, because this rhythm just repeats itself throughout almost like the entirety of the piece. There's not a ton of change as far as what's going on with the rhythm. It's pretty darn simple, but it sounds like this. And that just repeats itself and fits with the chords that's going on underneath it. And so, yeah, that part was easy. It was figuring out what to do harmonically. That was almost more of the challenge for me in this piece, because I wanted it to sound very similar to Rue's Farewell. So now if we just play this opening 8-bar section, you'll see it's pretty darn repetitive, yet works in this very emotional way. And another thing that makes this work at the end is that I've got the 5 of the chord, the D minor chord, which is our minor 4. It's one of the outer voices here. In this case, it's the top voice in the melody. So we are returning home in the sense that we're returning to this A. It's just not an A minor. It's a D minor. So I still think it works pretty well in the context of feeling like an incomplete cadence, which is what I wanted. Of course, I didn't want the piece to feel done at this point. The other quick thing to just look for when you're voicing these chords, again, something that's really important to do, I think, in the piano sketch, just to get it down, to not have to think about it a ton later on, is to pay attention for parallel fifths and octaves in our outer voice and our lowest voice. These are going to sound really wonky. If we're going down in our bass, we don't want to be going down into a fifth or an octave. So because we're going down to this G from the A, for instance, we would not want this note to be going, let's say the melody went up here. This would be a parallel fifth because we're going down. It's not that this could be this. This could be any note. It's not that we're going from a fifth to a fifth. That's not what we mean by this. What we mean is that the melody is moving in the same direction as the bass and is resolving into a fifth. That's the important part. That's going to, because the fifth sounds so it sounds so I don't know what the word I'm looking for is here, but they sound as close to being one note as you can sort of get in music. It's called the perfect fifth. They work together in the harmonic series so well that when you've got something that's moving into a parallel fifth, moving in the same direction into a fifth, the notes blur together, and you like it. It's almost like it's almost like running into like phase issues, where they sort of like cancel each other out, and it feels really thin. And the same thing for if our melody went up here and we went down into an octave, that would sound particularly, if this is our melody. You hear that? it stands out a little bit more with the piano because of how percussive it is. But in a string section with orchestral instruments, I mean, with any instrument, but particularly with orchestral instruments, this is just going to fade into nothingness. So we don't want this, and we don't want this. Is the important point to take note of. So I'm on the lookout for that, as whenever my bass line changes, I'm paying attention to that. And this chord into the 4 here, this we are moving into an octave. This is a D and a D, but this is good, or I shouldn't say it's good. It can be good because it's not parallel. The melody is going up, whereas the bass line is going down. So this is good. And as the bass line moves up here, you can see that the melody is actually staying, blanking on the word, but it's not going up or down in pitch. It's just staying constant. So we've got this, which is good. That's allowed. And the same thing here. As we move up in our bass line, we're staying constant, and then resolving down into the major third. And yeah, so just something to be mindful of. And if this is one of the main reasons you're going to start seeing lots of thirds in bases of chords is to avoid parallel octaves and fifths. So if you're confused as to when to try a slash chord with a third in the bass, you don't need, I mean, you can just play around with it and see what sounds good. That's one option. But the other option is if you're really paying attention for the parallel fifths and octaves, you're going to be forced in many cases into using a third in the base of a chord to avoid it. And so it'll come up naturally, and it'll sound really good counterpunctually when you do so, and it's sort of a fun, rewarding thing. But let's move into this transition section here, which is going to be from starting on a chord that we haven't. Actually, no, excuse me. We're starting on our A minor with the third in the bass. We're moving down to our E minor, right? But this section you can see is growing vertically, but going down. We're adding more bass to this, which is my way of building tension without necessarily going vertical. I could have gone vertically in the opposite direction, but I just liked this. I really like the sound of falling, descending bass lines. There's something very interesting to me, which is a total generalization, but I think for the most part it tends to be true. It's just something that I don't know. I find fascinating, which is that a lot of the time descending chords, bass lines, melodies can bring out a feeling of literally falling down, like getting knocked down, like all these analogies we have about heartbreak, about sadness, about the world screwing you over. And a lot of the times when we're rising, it's like we're coming back up. It's a burst of energy. It's a feeling of motivation. It's like we can do this. Just something to think about. And when you're looking at and analyzing music, pay attention for when composers are using descending versus ascending lines. And a lot of the time there's a correlation there, which is just another way of sort of the mathematics of music correlating with the way that we interact with the world in such an interesting way. So as the melody is staying pretty darn stable here, revolving around essentially this C, which is our minor third, the bass line is falling. So we've got this minor 1 into a minor 5 into a major 7 down into our major 6, which is a chord which hasn't come up yet, our F major, down into our minor 4, and then up into the major 5. And in this context, this G sharp really stands out. We had it here earlier, but you could sort of see there's all this stagnation of notes hitting at different times. You can hear it that the major 5 comes in for a second, that we get this leading tone, but it's not going up into the A, so it doesn't necessarily stand out as a leading tone the way it does here, where we're going from our root down to our G sharp, back up to our A and the melody. So if I play this section, you can feel that it feels a little bit less like a chord progression and more like something that's just building tension and setting us up for something. And then we return to our A theme. And harmonically, we're pretty much doing the exact same thing for the first 4 bars. We're going from our minor 1 to our minor 5, again with a third in the bass, up to minor 4 to, I guess this would most appropriately be, frankly, it's sort of like our major 3 here, because that B doesn't appear. But given the fact that this is familiar to the ear and that this voicing has been used before, even though there's not the minor third of that 5th there, it sort of works functionally as the same thing. It doesn't feel like we've introduced this new major 3 chord, which we haven't heard yet in the piece, to my ear anyways. And then we go into our suspended 7 down into the major 7. And then in this case, I've got, in Rue's Farewell, that when the piece really grows, one thing I really liked was this jump. We've got one jump in the melody up an octave. So I wanted to fall, instead of letting this just hang like this, from the C down to the B up to the A, I intentionally brought it down to the A so that we could get this jump up an octave into the biggest section of the piece. So let's listen to just this 4-bar section, which again, harmonically is the same as the beginning. The melody has just changed a little bit. We've got this falling line in the melody instead of a sort of more stagnant line like in the beginning of the piece. And then this is where it really starts to grow. Whereas in the first section, we had a lot of, we were harmonic. Our harmonic rhythm was pretty upbeat. We were changing chords relatively frequently. This big section is just a rotation back and forth between our minor 4 and our minor 5, with the third of our 4 in the bass, this F. Note there. No, I didn't. Oh, no, I lied. We're using our major 3 here. Excuse me. So now we're really hopping into this major 3 sound, and then to our minor 5. And switching back and forth between those 2 chords for the final 4 sections of this. As the piece raises itself on the downbeat, you can see here as we're reaching the climax of this piece, we're going up by step diatonically by step, staying in A minor, growing until we reach our sort of cadence here as we set up for the outro. And then another thing that's going on, which is it's something I just am obsessed with and probably need to start figuring out another thing to do with my counter melodies or counter lines. But I just love in these big climactic crescendo parts of my orchestration to take essentially like a cello or a horn line and just fill it out with mostly chord tones that are just raising like an arpeggio. So you can see as our melody is falling here, this what I knew was going to be a cello line is rising, and we get this awesome counter movement that feels really big and epic. When in reality, this is just like an F major chord to an E minor to an F major to an E minor. And then we go to the outro, which this part, there is nothing original to me. This is literally a direct copy and paste from how Rue's Farewell ended. And that's because I wanted to learn from this. I wanted to show this to people on YouTube to learn from it because I thought it was so well done. I didn't want to change anything, to be honest, because I really wanted to ingrain it in my memory what was going on here. I thought that this was such a cool sound. So throughout the course of the piece, right, our 4 chord has been an important chord that we've used. And obviously, so is the 1 chord. The 1 chord will always be important. So this transition section, or this outro section, really, is just one giant build-up. It's the end of the piece. In the context of the film, which I think is always really important to think about when analyzing any of these cues, what's going on emotionally? What are we supposed to feel when this is over? How do we capture that in music? Rue's Farewell, really, in my mind, is like is one of the crucial breaking points for Katniss. In the first film, when Rue dies, it breaks Katniss to a point where she hasn't been broken yet in the movie. So far, all the people who've died, it's of course unsettling to her, but they're not people she had relationships with. This is a little girl being killed for no reason in the context of games which have no significance other than the entertainment of the wealthy in the capital, right? So this is as heartbreaking, as evil as it gets. And this is a breaking point for her where it becomes bigger than her. And it's about more than just her sadness for losing a friend she made in the games. This is a boiling point of rage for not just her and District 12, but also really strongly District 11, where Rue is from. And a lot of the outer districts feel this. They could see the connection between Katniss and Rue. They were all sort of rooting for it. This is, in the context of oppression, these people are looking for anything that they can grasp onto to give them any semblance of hope. And so these two people from the outer districts working together, surviving for as long as they did in the games, was this awesome, happy thing. And when Rue dies and Katniss gives her a proper burial, which is not supposed to really be something that happens in the games, these are supposed to be people fighting. It's sort of like, from the Capitol's perspective, it's this conquering of these people who are being completely and utterly oppressed for their financial gain. And Snow and the whole gang in the Capitol, right? There's this sort of like, we've put you in such an incredibly screwed up, disgusting, tormented situation where you're all fighting for your lives. And it's like, it's this look at the power we have over you, where as much as you all maybe are fundamentally mad at us, we're putting you all in a pit where you have to fight to the death, and you have no choice but to do our bidding and fight amongst yourselves for literally no purpose other than our entertainment. And when Katniss breaks that and gives her sort of a burial, it really is a sort of middle finger to Snow and to the Capitol in a way that's really moving. And it's the first time that we feel, as both an audience and those watching in the districts, were sort of implied that this is a time where this is the first of our key breaking points of a call to action. So this is, on the one hand, it's heartbreaking and it's sad, and it's the story between two people, of Katniss and Rue, which is really devastating, and it's the loss of a friendship. But on a more broad scale, this is a call to action piece. This is we have felt this so much, we are so angry and frustrated that we have no choice but to start thinking about and just acting in any way we can to fight back. And so instead of ending on some really sad, soft chord, like we might if the context of this cue was just about the loss of a friend, we instead end on this incredibly intense, distorted buildup of this chord, which isn't just a triad. It's sort of a weird. We're ending on this chord, which is our it's our minor 4. It's a D minor. And then we've got the 2, which voiced where it is would more commonly be referred to as a 9. And then we've got our minor 3rd, the F. And then we've got this major 6 in the B. So if you want to play those a little bit more quickly, we get this would be a chord that could exist in D Dorian. It's not a chord that could exist in the context of a minor scale because we're using that major 6. So we end on this chord, which in and of itself is this perfect representation of the dark minor sound, but with a major 6 on it, which when you think about like today's jazz music, right, the major 6 is like a really beautiful resolution that gets used a lot in music. So to have that major 6 sound on top of a minor chord is really heartbreaking, but it's also just like this. But there's also a beauty to it in what Rue represents. So there's all these conflicting emotions, which I just think that when you think about all of that and how we convey that in music, it's a really cool thing to be able to do that in a really effective way with this kind of chord and this kind of crescendo where we're really building to a really loud, uncomfortable point at the end of this piece. This isn't particularly pleasant to listen to. This is uncomfortable, and it's a call to action. And when this piece gets played in the second movie, in Catching Fire, of course, this is when they're doing the tour. And when they get to District 11, one of the guys in the crowd does the Mockingbird thing, and then gets shot publicly, gets publicly executed for it. This is like one of those, again, where the Capitol's pushing it too far. This is a call to action. And to be able to convey that so just incredibly well in musical format, I just think is awesome. It's one of the reasons that I love film music and will never stop being interested in learning about different ways to convey the entire range of human emotion through music. And so, yeah, I didn't change a thing. We're just going minor 4, minor 1, minor 4, minor 1, and then as we sustain our A minor up in the right hand, we're walking down this bass line 7, 6, 5 down to our 4, which is this like D minor, which is a D minor, add 9 with a major 6 on it. There's probably some proper jazz way to name that chord that I'm not familiar with. But yeah, so sorry if that was a long rant, but I think it's all important to think about when we're writing this kind of music. And I just think more than anything, it's just pretty cool. So as far as the orchestration goes, it's relatively simple. It's like grabbing the lower voice, putting it on the cello, grabbing the upper voice, putting it on the violin. This is a really strings dominant piece. And if I just highlight some of our main pieces here, you can see the purple here being our violins, second violins, violas, cello. And we get a piece which translates really well over into the strings. And then we get this transition section. And then as it grows, we bring the we bring in the bass again. So you'll see again, really just sort of 5 voicings going on, but this feels pretty big. And in large part, that's because compared to earlier in the piece, we're sort of following, for the most part, the traditional harmonic series voicings of like octave to fifth. And then we've got this fourth here. And so lots of octaves in the bass followed by a fifth, which is going to get a really big, massive sound, as opposed to the beginning where things are a little bit more tightly voiced. And then we've got that cello line that comes in, which is followed by, once it got up high enough and it was started to descend, I wanted it to be taken over by the second violin. So we've got this part. Yeah, so as far as what's going on in the strings, it's really not a ton going on. I made a few, it's not, there's nothing really going on in the strings that's different from the way I voiced things or wrote things in the piano sketch. It's a lot of copying and pasting, and then playing around with just, what I end up playing around with is, of course, like the mod wheel and note velocities and legato transitions and that kind of stuff, but there's nothing new that's happening here. Like, this is just the line that I intended to be for the cello from the piano sketch. Added a few, there's a solo cello and a solo violin. So in the beginning, doubling the first violins is this solo cello, which I think the solo cello is like perhaps my favorite sound in the world. It's so gorgeous. I mean, you listen to the melody on the violins, which, don't get me wrong, it sounds awesome. But man, the sound of a solo cello is just freaking gorgeous. And way up, high up in its register, there's a lot of tension there. And so when you layer that with the first violins, with the cello, of course, panned a little bit right, like it would be in an orchestra, and the violins panned a little bit left, we get this thing going on in the stereo field on top of like a section versus a solo player, which I think just is really awesome and beautiful in the beginning of the piece. Gives it a fair amount of clarity. And then later on in the piece, the solo cello comes back again to double the melody, along with a solo violin, just for to help give the melody clarity. I wanted the attack of the melody to really be clear, so layering these solo instruments, which in many ways function as additions of close mics, but again, it's just on a solo instrument, so it doesn't become too muddy in the mix. We get this as a way of doubling with the first violin sections to help them really stand out. Yeah, and other than that, it's just sort of filling in the pieces. Like I said, we get the cello playing this ascending line. Yeah, and then it's taking similar, if not the same parts, and just putting them into choir, which is part of the original piece, definitely, is the choir. That was a little weird. Cool. And then similar thing with brass, just delaying some of the instruments coming in. So the beginning is really strings dominant, and then the brass isn't meant to really stand out other than just to give it that sort of weight and body and feeling of hugeness that brass at low to mid dynamics can really give you. And so during this return of our A theme here, there's only trombones and horns. And then as we get into our big tension building crescendo at the end, we introduce the trumpets, which is one of my favorite sounds, is the way that these trumpets, well, let me just play the whole thing. But the way these trumpets sound up in this high register, it really pierces through and creates this like beautiful, disgusting sound. Ugh, terrifying. And then, of course, we do have a little bit of percussion going on. We've got a harp highlighting a few important pieces or parts in the piece. We've got a timpani, which is again just a beautiful orchestral sound. The sort of tuned drum, you can think of it. But notice that the timpani hit happens 6 times in the piece here. It's not used a ton. This is meant to be heartbreaking and sad, and this is really a great case of less is more, where if I unmute everything, well, when I play through the piece again, because I don't want to play through the whole thing right now to make my point, when this timpani first hits, it really stands out, and it sets us up for this awesome big section at the end. Of course, the big crescendo of the piece, we're really pointing that out with the timpanis highlighting the bass line. We've got bass drums, which are becoming sort of growing in their frequency as the piece gets closer to the end. This point in the melody where it reaches its peaks, its highest points, we're highlighting that with a celeste, which I'm not sure whether or not the original piece did that, but I needed a little bit more. Cool sound. And yeah, that's about it for the orchestration. The orchestration wasn't particularly challenging because the piano sketch had been written in such a way that it was relatively easy to copy and paste stuff over. And whenever there's too many voices or whatever, I would just use a little divisi or maybe put something in the choir that wasn't in the strings. But I don't think I did that very much at all. I think I mostly, you can see there's a few like divisi notes here just where I needed an extra note. And then after that, it really was just a matter of playing in, our mod wheel data, getting that to sound good. One thing to note here is like during the actual main section of the piece, like we don't really hit anything that's super, super loud. We're not getting into fortissimo. We're just honestly getting around like forte, not really even that much higher. And I know when I was first got into programming orchestral music, I definitely I assumed that the big pieces of my music came from all my instruments just playing at max mod wheel, and it can get really muddy and sort of almost sound. It can begin to sound really fake really fast because it's not the way that an orchestra plays. So I think orchestration is orchestration and chord voicings are going to be by far the best way to make something sound huge, full, and epic, as opposed to just trying to play everything at max volume and hoping it sounds big. That'll sound sort of wonky if you do that too much. It's great for the end of the piece, though, when we're building into this massive crescendo, which is meant to sound pretty darn wonky. And just a few mixing things going on. I've got a fair amount of EQing that's just done by listening to the final mix, and then I add in some subtractive and a little bit of additive EQ depending on what's needed. Everything, of course, has got some low cut going on, where we're cutting out lows that we don't need to make sure that the bottom of the mix isn't getting muddy, which is applicable to all genres of music, but also just as true in orchestral music. Make sure your low end is clean. And it allows for instances where I do have like a little bit of compression on the string section. It allows the compressor to not totally botch the entire mix by taking into account too much low information that we don't need. So definitely, if you're going to be adding compression, it's super, super important, but it's probably pretty important no matter what, to make sure that your low end is tamed down a little bit. And then like each track has, I'm taking advantage of the Slate virtual mix rack and the Slate bundle, getting lots of analog simulation to try and give it that warmth and that nice distortion. So like I know on the choir, I remember this really sticking out to me, how much the Hollywood preamp here that I'm throwing on the choir really gives this some warmth. That one really stands out, and is giving wrong thing, giving it a little bit of a volume boost too, to be honest. But so yeah, taking advantage of hardware. I guess you'd call, I don't know what's the word I'm looking for. Hardware simulation. I use virtual channels on all of my group stacks, and then I use the virtual mix bus on the master to give it that feeling of going through a channel strip like you would in a good big professional studio. Preamps, and then using tape machines, all to give it some nice warmth and a little bit of slight distortion, but not in an unpleasant way, in a pleasant way, and that it's adding a few harmonics here and there, which help it feel much more alive and like it was actually recorded in a bigger professional studio or something like that. And then the other thing that allows me to do is, because like the choir, for instance, is relatively soft throughout the entire piece, I can boost that saturation on the preamp pretty high without it adding a ton of noticeable distortion. But like in the end, when we're building towards this crescendo, you can hear that the preamp really starts to give it some very notable distortion, which is helping build into the crescendo. Yeah. So I think that pretty much covers everything that's going on in the piece. Using my strings hall from Verb Suite Classic as my reverb. Got a limiter, tape, on the half-inch track. Got a VBC rack, but it's not doing any compression at all. The audio is just strictly running through it, which gives it more warmth and fullness. And then mix bus, and yeah, that's it. If there's anything I went too fast on, anything I went too slow on, anything that's confusing, or just you have any questions or comments, please do leave them below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll give this one final playthrough, and I'll catch you on the next one. Take care.